welcome to another Golden Hawk video. My name is Golden Hawk, and today we are going to be reading chapters 3 and 4 for Jim the Wonder Dog by Marty, Rhodes, Figley. Now, I'm really excited because we left on a bit of a cliffhanger in the last two chapters, and by the way, if you haven't seen that last video, part 1, Jim the Wonder Dog, link in the description below. But, without any further ado, let's get right into it. Chapter 3. Jim shows Mr. Sam. Even though Jim would not have won any beauty contests as a pup, he grew up to be a handsome and talented bird dog. Mr. Sam stopped counting after Jim scouted more than 5,000 quail during their many hunting trips. The setter was even named Hunting Dog of the Century by Missouri Life and Missouri Conservationist magazines. But that would come later. In his first years with Mr. Sam, Jim proved to be good at finding birds, but he bored easily if the hunt failed to produce quick results. As he had on those warm Missouri days under the tree when he was a pup, Jim seemed to know when there were no birds to be found, and he did not waste his energy trying to prove otherwise. There was no denying his smarts. Mr. Sam and his wife Pearl took to talking to Jim as if he were a person. But then, truth be told, they did all of that with their pets. Yes, Jim had grown into a fine hunter, but the verdict was still out on how special he was. The year he turned 3 changed all of that. One day that year, Dog and Master were out hunting on an unusually hot October afternoon. Mr. Sam muttered aloud to Jim that they should just take a rest under the nearby hickory tree. Jim ran ahead of Mr. Sam right to the hickory tree. What was going on? Did Jim know that was a hickory tree? Intrigued, Mr. Sam decided to ask Jim to show him a black oak tree. Jim strolled over to a black oak and touched its trunk with his paw. Maybe Jim was just lucky. Mr. Sam couldn't resist asking Jim to find another tree. This time he requested a walnut. Jim lopped right over to a walnut tree and plopped his paw right on it. This was just plain wacky. Fascinated now, Mr. Sam kept testing Jim, knowing full well that if anybody had happened to see the man and his dog playing their show-me game, they would have thought Mr. Sam had been drinking bathtub gin. No matter, the game was on. Mr. Sam asked Jim to find a stump next. Jim found one. Then Mr. Sam asked him to find hazel bushes, a cedar tree, and an old tin can. Jim did so, touching each and every one as it was named. Mr. Sam couldn't get home fast enough to tell Pearl that Jim seemed to have quite a vocabulary and to understand what he said. And amazingly, that normally recalcitrant dog continued to do anything that Mr. Sam told him to do. It was nice that Mr. Sam thought Jim was so smart, but it is likely his wife had her doubts. Pearl told Mr. Sam he shouldn't tell anyone else about Jim's talents. They might well think her husband was full of baloney. Mr. Sam decided the only way to convince Pearl was to show her. So he took her and Jim back out to the hunting field. There he had Jim find all the trees, bushes, stumps, and even the tin can, again for Pearl. Jim matter-of-factly located everything correctly a second time with no mistakes. Pearl stood silent, amazed. Mr. Sam grinned at her and said, "We have something here, haven't we, dear?" Chapter 4. The Talk of the Town. Despite Pearl's warning, Mr. Sam did not stay quiet about Jim's newly found talents. The news about Jim was so exciting that he couldn't help but spill the beans. At first, when Mr. Sam told his friends about how smart Jim was and what he could do, they laughed at him. They wanted to test the dog. So Mr. Sam and Jim showed them. It was only fitting. After all, Missouri is the show-me state. And sure enough, no matter what "can you show me" question Mr. Sam asked of Jim, Jim responded correctly. And soon he was doing it for the occasional townsfolk. It became a regular local attraction. No one ever got tired of Jim locating things. But one day, while talking outside the hotel with a man whose car was parked nearby, Mr. Sam decided to try something new. He looked down at Jim and asked him to find the man's car. Both men were shocked when the dog calmly strolled right over to the vehicle and touched the fender with his paw. Not too long afterward, a close friend of Mr. Sam's had the idea of writing his car's license plate number, 19248, on a piece of paper and seeing if Jim was smart enough to find his car. From only that. Mr. Sam was afraid it would be too difficult a task for Jim. After all, everyone knows that dogs can't read, but sure enough, Jim ran down the street about half a block, past several packed cars. He stopped right in front of the car with the license plate number 19248 and plopped his paw right on it. Jim was now the talk of the town. In many ways, the clever pooch couldn't have picked a better time to make his talents known to the rural community. Local citizens, like Americans all over the United States, had need of a little good cheer. The country was in a deep economic depression, what came to be called the Great Depression, the worst in our country's history. Banks had closed, farms had lost, money was short, and jobs hard to find. People were hungry and scared. One of the popular songs of the time was, "Brother, can you spare a dime?" People needed cheering up. A black and white hunting dog that seemed almost human, could do things that no one could explain, was just the ticket. Soon, crowds of folks from near and far began to gather the hotel to see Jim perform. Watching and wondering about Jim and how he did what he did took people's minds off of their worries and grumbling stomachs, if only for a little while. Meanwhile, Mr. Sam, who usually kept his dogs outside in a kennel, decided to make an exception for Jim. He brought the setter with the intelligent eyes inside to live with Pearl and him. Jim was officially part of their family. Our conclusion for the day is about Jim and somehow him finding all of this crazy stuff so quickly, calmly, and just so quickly. I mean, usually dogs can't do that, but he can. So far, this book is going great, and I really hope you're enjoying it so far. So remember to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more videos, and I will see you next time.